The intelligence came in on a Tuesday. Claire Dunning brought it to Guilliman herself, walking quickly down the corridor of the planning center on Reach, with a datapad in her hand and the specific look on her face that meant the news was large. She had worked with him long enough to stop being intimidated by his size or his silence, and she had learned that the best way to brief him was to skip the preamble and state the fact. "We have a Covenant fleet assembling at the edge of the Salamis system," she said, handing him the pad. 47 warships confirmed, 2 carriers, a heavy cruiser group, and 1 assault carrier. Our analysts are calling it the largest single strike force we've tracked since Harvest. Guilliman looked at the data. He did not ask her to wait while he read it. He read it in about 12 seconds and handed the pad back. "Where are they going?" he said. "New Carthage," she said. "The shipyards." He nodded once. "How long before they move?" "Best estimate, 9 days, maybe 10. "That is enough time," he said, and walked past her toward the planning room. She stood in the corridor for a moment after he left, looking at the empty space where he had been standing. Then she followed him, because when Guilliman said, "That is enough time," it always meant that work was about to begin. New Carthage was not the most famous system in UNSC territory. It was not a major population center, but the shipyards in orbit above the planet's third moon produced a significant share of the Navy's frigate-class vessels. And losing those yards would be a blow that would take years to recover from. The Covenant knew this, or had calculated it, or had been told it by their prophets, or whatever it was that drove their targeting decisions. The shipyards had to be defended. Guilliman had no intention of defending them the straightforward way. Matching the Covenant ship for ship was a losing game. UNSC vessels were outgunned in a direct exchange. Energy shielding gave the enemy an edge in any straight fight that was very difficult to overcome through bravery alone. Fighting bravely and dying was not a strategy. It was just dying. Instead, he spent the next 6 days turning the New Carthage debris field into a weapon. The debris field was a wide band of asteroid fragments and mining refuse that sat at the outer edge of the system, a navigational hazard that most ships simply plodded around. Guilliman had looked at it on the star charts and seen something different. He had seen cover. He had seen a killing ground. Working with a team of engineers and a shipboard tactical AI designated Petra, he ordered the largest asteroid bodies in the field quietly hollowed out over 6 days. Inside each one, construction crews installed remote-operated mass driver platforms, essentially very large guns mounted inside rocks, completely invisible to any external sensor scan. The platforms were linked to Petra's targeting system and slaved to a single command relay aboard the UNSC command ship. They also repositioned the visible UNSC defensive fleet to a point that would look, to a Covenant commander, like exactly what it was. Insufficient. 2 ships, too spread out, easy prey. That was the point. Captain Ryan Mace was given command of the lead defensive line. He was 43, broad-shouldered, quiet in the way that people who have been in real danger often become quiet. He had commanded 3 frigates over his career, and had developed a reputation for holding his position when other commanders flinched. That was why Guilliman had chosen him. In the briefing before the battle, Mace sat in a chair and listened to the entire plan without interrupting. At the end of it, he looked up and said, "You're asking me to hold steady while 47 warships come at us. My crew is going to think I've lost my mind." "Tell them the truth," Guilliman said. "Tell them you have a plan, and that holding the line is the most important thing they can do. Soldiers can handle fear. What they cannot handle is uncertainty. Remove the uncertainty." Mace thought about that. Then he nodded. "What's the signal to fire?" "I will give it," Guilliman said. "The timing is everything. On the day the Covenant fleet dropped out of slipspace at the edge of the New Carthage system, there were exactly 3 seconds of silence on the bridge of every UNSC vessel in the area. 3 seconds where everybody stared at the tactical screens and counted the red markers appearing one after another, filling up the display like a spreading bruise. 47 warships. Exactly as predicted. The assault carrier was enormous. Its designation, pulled from a piece of intercepted communication by Claire Dunning's team, translated roughly as righteous cleansing of the unworthy. It moved at the center of the Covenant formation, flanked by cruisers, its plasma weapon banks cycling up to firing temperature. Its shields glowed faintly, even at this distance. On the bridge of his frigate, Carthage's Gate, Ryan Mace gripped the arm of his command chair and said 2 words to his crew. "Hold here." His navigation officer, a young woman named Megan Ferris, was 26 years old and had been in the Navy for 4 years. In those 4 years, she had never seen anything except UNSC retreats and UNSC losses. She watched the Covenant fleet advancing on the screen and kept her hands on her console and did not say anything, because Captain Mace had said hold, and she trusted that word, even though every nerve in her body was pushing her in the other direction. The Covenant advanced with the confidence of a force that expected no real resistance. Their shields were up. Their weapons were hot. They moved in tight formation, reading the small UNSC defensive line ahead of them as exactly what it appeared to be. A token resistance that would either flee or die. They did not look at the asteroids. Why would they? Asteroids were rocks. Guilliman watched the tactical feed from the command ship. He watched the Covenant formation move through the outer edge of the debris field. He watched them pass the first line of hidden platforms, then the second. He waited until the lead cruisers were bracketed on 3 sides by platforms they could not see. Then he gave the signal. The asteroids opened. The first volley hit simultaneously from 4 directions. 12 mass driver rounds, moving at a fraction below the speed of light, struck the 2 lead cruisers before their shield operators had any idea what was happening. Covenant shields were formidable against energy weapons. Against kinetic mass moving at that velocity, they lasted a moment longer than they might have otherwise. And then, they failed. Both cruisers broke apart. The Covenant fleet reacted with speed, disciplined, trained, not fools. Yet discipline and training require time to translate into action, and the second volley was already on its way before the first had finished. 3 more ships took hits. One of them lost power to its drive systems and began drifting. Another took a round through its ammunition storage and came apart from the inside. The assault carrier, the righteous cleansing of the unworthy, was the primary target. Guilliman had spent 3 weeks studying captured Covenant wreckage, specifically looking for structural weaknesses in assault carrier design. He had found one. The secondary power coupling that ran along the port side of the lower hull was positioned, for reasons he suspected were more ceremonial than practical, slightly outside the main shield envelope. A clean hit there would not necessarily destroy the carrier, but it would cascade. Petra calculated the firing solution. The mass driver platform that took the shot was buried inside an asteroid that had been floating unremarkably in the debris field for 6 days. The round crossed the distance in a fraction of a second. It hit. The secondary power coupling failed. The cascade spread to the primary reactor through 3 connected systems that were never meant to absorb that kind of shock. The righteous cleansing of the unworthy broke in half along a 40-kilometer span, its forward section rolling slowly away from its rear section in a debris cloud that would still be visible from the system's outer edge 3 days later. The Covenant fleet retreated. Not in panic, they withdrew in order, covering their damaged ships, pulling back at a measured pace that showed training even in defeat, but they retreated. For the first time in the war, a major Covenant fleet had been turned back without glassing its target. On the bridge of the Carthage's Gate, Megan Ferris looked at the tactical screen for a long time. She watched the red markers moving away. She watched the count of enemy ships falling below 30 as wreckage filled the margins of the display. She had grown up expecting to die in this war. Not because she was pessimistic, but because that was simply what the numbers had always suggested. She started crying quietly, and she did not stop for a while, and she did not feel embarrassed about it. Ryan Mace noticed, but said nothing. He understood. He was staring at the screen himself, with the expression of a man who had not yet fully processed what his eyes were telling him. On the command ship, Guilliman studied the aftermath data and was already calculating the next move. He noted the outcome without satisfaction or relief, not because he did not care, but because caring about a single victory was a luxury a war could not afford. But he knew what this moment would mean. He had fought long enough to understand what one win could do to people who had only known loss. He let them have the night. Tomorrow, there would be more work. What if Guilliman led the UNSC in the Covenant invasion? The Battle of New Carthage did not end the war. Guilliman had never said it would. He had never made that kind of promise, and the people who worked closest to him had learned that this was one of the things that made him different from every other commander they had ever served under. He did not offer comfort through false certainty. He told the truth, even when the truth was hard, and the truth was this: the Covenant was vast, its fleets were many, and its profits would not stop simply because one assault carrier had been destroyed. What the battle did do was something more complicated and more valuable than ending the war. It changed what people believed was possible. That change moved quietly. It did not announce itself. It showed up in small things, in the way soldiers talked in corridors after the news came through, in the tone of field reports that reached Admiral Cole's desk in the weeks following New Carthage, in the way recruitment officers started hearing different questions from the people coming to sign up. Before the battle, people asked how bad it was going to get. After it, people started asking how they could help turn it around. Cole noticed this shift in language before anyone else said anything about it out loud. He wrote it down in his personal log with the note, "They stopped saying when we lose, and started saying when we win. That's the first genuinely good news I've written in 3 years." He did not tell Guilliman about it. Guilliman would have said something practical about sustained effort being more important than morale indicators. Cole kept the observation to himself, like a small, warm thing he was not ready to share. The work continued. Guilliman pushed the reformation of the UNSC's command structure deeper in the months after New Carthage. He spent 2 weeks on Circumstance, overseeing the first fully operational rapid response unit built around a Spartan anchor. The Spartan was a woman named Grace Owens, who had been in the program since she was 6 years old, and had never in her life been asked what she thought of her deployments. Guilliman asked her. She told him plainly that being dropped alone into impossible situations had stopped feeling like a mission a long time ago, and had started feeling like execution. He listened to all of it, and then he restructured her unit's operational brief from the ground up. When that unit ran its first real deployment, an extraction operation on a colony under Covenant assault, it pulled out 1,100 civilians and lost no one. Grace Owens filed a standard after-action report. Somewhere in the middle of it, in the plain clinical language that soldiers use for these documents, she wrote, "Unit cohesion was exceptional. We'll recommend this deployment model for all Spartan assets going forward." Guilliman read the report in under a minute. He set it down and moved to the next one. But Claire Dunning, who had been in the room when he read it, noticed that he paused for just a moment before picking up the next document. She had worked with him long enough to know that a pause for him was the equivalent of a long exhale of relief for anyone else. On the intelligence front, Dunning's Theology Division had started producing results that were changing the way the UNSC targeted its limited offensive resources. By studying the Covenant's religious calendar and mapping it against attack patterns, her team had identified a predictable cycle in the enemy's operational tempo. Periods of heightened aggression tied to specific dates of religious significance. followed by brief periods of consolidation. It was not a large window, but it was a window, and Guilliman used every one of them. 3 separate ambushes were run during those consolidation windows over the following 6 months. None of them were on the scale of New Carthage. They did not need to be. They hit supply convoys, disrupted Covenant positioning, and sent a message that the UNSC was now reading the enemy in ways the enemy did not know about. What the Covenant had always relied on was the certainty that humanity was reacting, never acting. That certainty began, slowly, to erode. Not everyone accepted the changes easily. There were officers who submitted transfers rather than work under the new framework. There were politicians on the Security Council who looked for opportunities to roll back Guilliman's authority when things were quiet. Cole handled most of them with the particular kind of tired patience that comes from running out of anger and having only stubbornness left. Twice he told the council, plainly, that if they wanted to return to the way things had been run before Guilliman arrived, they were welcome to do so, but they should be honest with themselves about what those results had looked like. Both times, the pushback faded. It was 5 months after New Carthage when Guilliman visited the medical wing of the base on Reach and met a Spartan in recovery. The Spartan's name was Kevin Rios. He was 19 years old. He had been in the program since childhood, pulled from his colony world and built into something extraordinary by a process that had not asked his permission. At New Carthage, his unit had taken fire during the ground defense operation supporting the space battle above, and he had taken 2 serious wounds, keeping 3 other soldiers alive. The medical report said he would recover fully. It did not say anything about the fact that he was 19 and had never known a single day of peacetime. Guilliman came into the room without any of his usual purposefulness. He pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down, which put him closer to eye level with the young man, and he looked at him for a moment without speaking. Kevin Rios looked back, wary the way Spartans always were wary, not afraid, just careful. "How are you healing?" Guilliman asked. "Fine," Kevin said. "The doctors say 3 more weeks." "Good," Guilliman said. Then he was quiet for a moment. "I want to ask you something. Not a strategic question, not a mission debrief. Something else." Kevin waited. "What do you want the future to look like?" Guilliman said. "Not what you are willing to die for. What you want to live for. If the war ended tomorrow, and you had a choice about what came next, what would you choose?" The question clearly surprised the young man. He looked at Guilliman for a moment, with the expression of someone who has been asked something in a language they understand, but rarely use. He was quiet for a while. Guilliman did not fill the silence. He waited with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world, even though he never actually did. Kevin talked, eventually, haltingly at first, and then more steadily. He talked about a colony called Broad River, where he had lived until he was 6 years old. He talked about green hills that ran down to a river valley. He talked about a sky with 2 moons that both rose on the same horizon in summer. He talked about the smell of rain on dry ground, which he had read was called petrichor, and which he had not smelled in 13 years. He talked about it the way people talk about things they are afraid they are starting to forget. Guilliman listened to every word. When Kevin was done, Guilliman stood. He straightened to his full height and looked down at the young man in the bed and said, simply and without theater, "Then fight for that. Not for the UNSC. Not for command decisions. Not for any order you have ever been given. Fight for the hills and the river and the 2 moons rising. That is what soldiers lose track of, and that is what you must never let go of." Kevin Rios said nothing. He looked at the ceiling for a moment and then nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when something has settled into place inside them. Guilliman walked out of the medical wing and did not look back. The war continued. It would continue for a long time. The Covenant was not broken, not beaten, not even seriously slowed in the grand scope of things. But the humanity it was fighting was not the same humanity it had first come against at Harvest. It had a doctrine now, and a direction, and something that might be the early shape of a strategy, rather than a collection of desperate responses. Years later, a historian writing about this period would struggle to explain in plain words what exactly had changed. She would write that Guilliman had not given humanity better ships, or better weapons, or better soldiers. What he had given them was something harder to define, and more important than any of those things. He had looked at a species fighting for its life, and treated it as though it was a civilization worth the trouble of saving. Not just defending, saving. It took the people around him years to understand what he meant by it, and by the time they understood, they had already started doing it themselves. Somewhere in the dark between stars, a reformed UNSC fleet moved in perfect order along a resupply corridor that had not existed 2 years ago. Its crews knew their roles, they knew their routes, they knew where they were going and why. And at the head of it all, in blue and gold that belonged to a universe no one on those ships would ever visit, a Primarch who had lost everything he had ever built, sat quietly with the next set of tactical reports, and did the only thing he had ever known how to do. He prepared. He planned. He worked. He built something that might last. What if Guilliman led the UNSC in the Covenant invasion? The year was 2525, and the war had no good name yet. People called it different things. Some called it the Covenant War. Some called it the Alien War. Soldiers who had survived the first engagements simply called it the end, because that was what it felt like. No one was certain which name would last, mostly because no one was sure there would be people alive long enough to write it down in history books. Harvest was already gone. The planet had been home to millions of ordinary people, farmers, teachers, engineers, children who had never done anything to anyone. The Covenant had come to Harvest with their plasma beams and their warships, and their absolute unshakable belief that humanity had no right to exist. When the Covenant fleet left, Harvest was a scorched rock drifting in space. The fires had burned so hot that the oceans had evaporated. There was nothing left, not a building, not a tree, not a single living thing. The UNSC scrambled to understand what had hit them. They sent ships to investigate. They pulled black boxes and wreckage from the void. They read every signal that had managed to get out before it was cut off. The conclusion was simple and brutal. The enemy had better weapons, stronger shields, faster ships, and a religious conviction that made negotiation impossible. There would be no talks. There would be no peace offer. There would only be fire coming from the sky until humanity was gone. Captain Nathan Voss was not the kind of man who panicked. He had served 14 years in the UNSC Navy. He was 39, lean and quiet, with close-cut brown hair, and a habit of rubbing the back of his neck when something was bothering him. He had survived 2 engagements with insurrectionist forces, and 1 collision with a debris field that by all reasonable mathematics should have killed everyone aboard his ship. He was experienced enough to know when a situation was bad, and calm enough not to show it on his face. On the morning of October 14th, 2525, he was rubbing the back of his neck quite a lot. His ship, the Argo's Call, was a light frigate assigned to deep survey work near the outer edge of the Epsilon Eridani system. It was not glamorous duty. It meant long stretches of empty space, quiet shifts, and sensor readings that almost always turned out to be nothing. Voss had put in 2 requests for a combat posting. Both times he had been told the survey routes needed experienced commanders. He had accepted it without complaint. That was the kind of man he was. His sensor officer that morning was a young petty officer named Donna Park, 24 years old, 3 years out of the academy, and normally very composed. When she called him to the bridge, he noticed right away that her voice had something in it he hadn't heard from her before. Not fear, exactly. More like confusion that had run out of room inside her head and was looking for somewhere to go. "Sir," she said when he stepped onto the bridge, "you need to see this." The main view screen showed open space, stars, darkness, nothing strange at first glance. But the sensor overlay told a different story. There was a point of energy ahead of them, roughly 40,000 kilometers out, and the ship's computer could not classify it. It was not a slipspace rupture. It did not match any known Covenant energy signature. It was not any natural phenomenon that had a name in any database the UNSC had ever compiled. It pulsed, slowly like something breathing. Voss stood at the center of the bridge and watched it. His crew watched him. He held up one hand before anyone could speak and studied the sensor readings himself. The computer kept trying to assign the phenomenon a category, and kept failing. The energy level was rising, slowly but steadily. "All weapons on standby," he said. "Hold our position. Nobody fires until I give the word." The light grew, or perhaps it came closer. The sensors gave contradictory answers. Donna Park said "sir" 3 times in a low, careful voice, and 3 times Voss held up his hand without looking away from the screen. Then the light opened. It opened the way a door opens, except the door was made of geometry that had no business existing in normal space, and it stood in the complete emptiness between stars. From inside it, something moved, something large, something that stepped out into hard vacuum and did not die. A small craft materialized around the figure, or perhaps the craft had always been there, and the light had simply been hiding it. The vessel was unlike anything in any UNSC record. It moved toward the Argo's call at a measured, unhurried speed, with no weapon signatures and no signals that read as hostile. Voss made the most important decision of his life in roughly 4 seconds. He opened a hailing channel. "Unknown vessel, this is Captain Nathan Voss of the UNSC frigate Argo's call. Identify yourself and state your intentions." The response did not come through any standard communication protocol. It came through every speaker on the bridge at once, in a voice that was deep and even, and carried a kind of weight that Voss had never heard in any human voice. It was the voice of something that had given orders for a very long time, and had not often been disobeyed. "I am Rabute Guilliman. I intend no harm. Request permission to come aboard." It took 20 minutes to get the docking bay ready, and another 10 minutes of very tense silence before the airlock cycled. 4 Marines were positioned at the entrance, armed and ready. When the airlock opened, they all reached for their weapons, and then none of them raised them. Not because they were told not to, because something about the figure standing in the corridor made the gesture feel like a mistake. Guilliman stood over 8 feet tall. His armor was the color of deep ocean water, trimmed with gold, layered in ways that suggested it had been made for serious and repeated use. There were markings on it that no one on the crew could read. His face was strong and still, the face of someone who had seen a great deal and decided long ago not to be surprised by any of it. His eyes were a clear, pale blue, and they moved across the room with the efficient calm of someone reading a map. He looked at the 4 Marines once, briefly. Then he looked at Voss. "Who commands here?" Voss stepped forward. "I do." Guilliman studied him for a moment. "Then I need you to take me to whoever commands your military as a whole. I have had time to observe your situation. I will explain more once we are underway. But time is a factor." Voss looked at him for a moment. "You've been on this ship for about 4 minutes. I was observing before I arrived," Guilliman said, without apology or emphasis. "The event that brought me here was not instantaneous. I was able to study your communications, enough to understand what you are facing, enough to understand that without significant change, you will lose this war." The bridge was very quiet. Behind Voss, Donna Park had stopped typing. The helmsman was staring. Even the Marine sergeant, a broad man named Cole Briggs, who had never looked uncertain about anything in his life, had gone still. Voss rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the view screen where the anomaly had completely closed, leaving nothing behind it. Whatever had opened to bring this figure here was shut now. There was no going back through it. Reach, Voss said after a moment. That's where Fleet Command is. 9 hours in slip space. Then we should leave now, Guilliman said. He had already turned to the nearest console and was studying the star charts displayed on it. No one had given him permission to do that. No one told him to stop. Voss looked at his helmsman. Set course for Reach. Best speed. As the Argo's call slipped into slipspace and the stars stretched and vanished, Guilliman settled into a chair at the secondary console and pulled up the entire archive of UNSC battle reports from the past 6 months. Every engagement, every loss, every tactical note from every surviving commander. He did not ask permission for that either. He did not sleep during those 9 hours. He read every word of every document, and by the time the ship dropped back into normal space above the blue-gray curve of Reach, he had not only read all of it, but had already, quietly, begun to form a plan. What if Guilliman led the UNSC in the Covenant invasion? Admiral Leonard Cole was a hard man. Not hard in the way that broke things, hard in the way that bent under pressure and came back straight. He had 61 years of life behind him, 34 of them in the Navy. He had gray hair he did not bother to comb carefully, a scar along his jaw from a hull breach that had nearly taken his head off in his 30s, and eyes that had seen enough war to stop flinching at bad news. When Nathan Voss escorted a figure in ancient blue armor into the lower briefing room of Fleet Command on Reach, Cole's first reaction was to reach slowly for the sidearm on his hip. Guilliman noticed. He stopped walking, placed both hands at his sides where they were clearly visible, and waited. He said nothing. He simply stood there and let the Admiral look at him. Cole looked for a long time. Then he took his hand off the sidearm. "Talk," he said. What followed was not a quick conversation. It lasted 3 days. During those 3 days, Guilliman was subjected to biological scans, medical evaluations, psychological assessments, and interrogation sessions with naval intelligence officers who came in rotating shifts, each trying a slightly different approach, none of them getting very far. He answered every question directly and completely. He did not become frustrated. He did not become defensive. He sat in the chair they gave him and spoke with the patience of someone who understood that trust had to be built from the ground up, especially when the thing asking for it was 8 feet tall and had arrived through an unexplainable hole in space. On the second night, when the interrogators had gone home and the guards had settled into their quiet posts, Guilliman asked for access to the full UNSC strategic database. The duty officer on watch, a nervous lieutenant named Gary Holt, sent an urgent message up the chain of command. The answer that came back, after 40 minutes of debate among people who should have been sleeping, was a cautious yes. They gave him read-only access. They logged every file he opened. They had 3 analysts watching the access records in real time. He read for 9 hours straight. In the morning, the interrogators came back and found that he had prepared his own briefing. Not a request, a briefing. He had organized his observations into clear sections and was ready to present them. Admiral Cole, who had gotten 4 hours of sleep and 2 cups of bad coffee, came in and sat down and told him to go ahead. Guilliman spoke for 2 hours without notes. He covered the UNSC's supply chain and why it was creating bottlenecks that were costing ships and crews during critical moments. He covered the Spartan program and explained why deploying the Spartans as individual lone assets was a waste of what they could be. He talked about the chain of command and where decisions were taking too long to reach the people who needed to make them. He described the complete absence of a coordinated fallback doctrine for colonies under attack, which meant that every time a colony was lost, the surviving population and ships scattered randomly into space, with no direction and no destination. Both times, Guilliman acknowledged the objection, explained why it was based on an incomplete view of the data, and moved on. When the briefing ended, Cole was quiet for a while. "Can it be fixed?" he asked. "The problems are serious," Guilliman said. "They are not fatal, not yet, but they will become fatal if they are not addressed soon." "That's not what I asked," Cole said. Guilliman looked at him directly. "Yes," he said, "it can be fixed, but not halfway. Either the changes are made fully and given the authority to hold, or they will be undermined before they take effect. I have seen that happen before, in other wars with other people. It does not end well." "And you're the man to make those changes," Cole said. It was not quite a question. "I am not asking for a title," Guilliman said. "I am asking for the authority to act. There is a difference. If you want to call me a consultant, call me a consultant. What matters is whether my recommendations are followed or debated into uselessness while more colonies burn." Cole looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood up, told everyone else to leave the room, and spent the next hour talking to Guilliman alone. No recording, no witnesses, just two men who understood war, sitting across a table from each other. What was said in that room stayed between them. What came out of it was Cole walking into the UNSC Security Council 2 days later and making the argument of his career. He told them what he had seen. He told them what he had heard. He told them that he had spent 34 years in the Navy, and he knew the difference between a man with a plan and a man with a theory, and this was a man with a plan. The Security Council argued for 11 days. That was 11 days of back and forth about authority, about trust, about the political risk of handing strategic command of the human war effort to a being who had arrived through a hole in space and had no verifiable origin. On the 9th day of those 11, a Covenant strike force hit a civilian transit station between Reach and the colony world of New Lhasa. 4,017 people died. The station's distress signal was still broadcasting when the Security Council resumed its session the following morning. Nobody said anything about it directly. They didn't have to. On the 11th day, Guilliman was brought before the council in person. He stood in the center of the chamber and waited to be addressed, and when the council chair asked him to state his case, he spoke for 12 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not appeal to emotion. He laid out a series of facts in clear, sequential order, and then he said, "Every day you delay this decision, you are spending lives to buy time you are not using. I am not asking you to trust me. I am asking you to look at what is happening to your species and decide whether what you have been doing so far is working." The vote passed. He was given no rank, no formal title that fit into any existing structure. He was given authority, the real, operational, decision-making kind, over UNSC strategic planning, fleet deployment, and resource allocation. Admiral Cole retained his position and became the bridge between Guilliman and the existing command structure. The first person to congratulate Guilliman afterward was an intelligence analyst named Claire Dunning, 29 years old, sharp-eyed, and one of the few people who had spent the past 2 weeks watching him without fear and without awe. She had written the report that described him as someone who thinks like an empire rather than a soldier. She walked up to him after the vote, looked up at him, and said, "I hope you're as good as you seem to think you are." Guilliman looked down at her. "So do I," he said. She blinked. She had not expected that answer. He was already walking toward the planning room. There was no time to waste, and he had never once in his life wasted any. What if Guilliman led the UNSC in the Covenant invasion? What happened next was not a miracle. Guilliman would have been the first to say so. Miracles were for people who did not understand logistics. What happened next was work. Long, grinding, unglamorous work. the kind that did not look impressive from the outside, but quietly changed everything it touched. He started with the Spartans. The Spartan II program had produced some of the most capable warriors humanity had ever seen. That was not in question. What was in question was how they were being used. Guilliman reviewed every deployment record, every mission log, every after-action report involving a Spartan asset. He read them in a single sitting that lasted most of a night, and by morning his conclusions were formed. The Spartans were being sent alone or in very small groups to do jobs that needed an army. They were being used as blunt instruments, dropped into impossible situations to buy time or cover retreats, when they could be doing something far more valuable. A Spartan alone could fight brilliantly. A Spartan at the center of a well-organized unit could make that entire unit fight brilliantly. One was multiplication, the other was addition. The difference over a long war was enormous. He met with the Spartans directly. No intermediaries, no briefing officers in between. He walked into the training facility on Reach where several of them were stationed, and he sat down across from them at a plain table, and he talked to them the way he had once talked to his own warriors. Not down to them, not above them, but straight at them, one soldier to another. They were quiet during that meeting. They watched him with the careful, measuring look that soldiers give to someone they are not yet sure about. A Spartan named Grace Owens asked him where he came from. He told her the truth, briefly and plainly, and she stared at him for a moment, and then nodded and asked her next question. Spartans, he noticed, were practical people. They did not have much patience for things that could not be used. He liked that about them. He restructured their deployment model over the following 2 weeks. Each available Spartan was paired with a reformed rapid response unit, hand-picked ODSTs, and infantry with strong records, and tasked with a specific role within a larger operational framework. The Spartan was not the unit's weapon. The Spartan was the unit's spine. Their presence, their judgment, their ability to read a battle and adapt faster than any standard soldier would hold the unit together when conditions fell apart. And in this war, conditions always fell apart. Then he turned to the Navy. The supply chain problem was less dramatic than the Spartan question, but in some ways, more important. A ship that ran out of ammunition or fuel at the wrong moment was worse than useless. It was a liability and a casualty waiting to happen. Guilliman had found 17 separate points in the UNSC's resupply network where delays compounded on each other, turning small inefficiencies into catastrophic gaps at the worst possible moments. He worked alongside a young logistics officer named Derek Hollis to rebuild it. Hollis was 27, methodical, and the kind of person who got genuinely excited about distribution models. Most people found this exhausting. Guilliman found it useful. The two of them spent long days going over fleet movement data, resupply timing, and depot positioning. Hollis would run the numbers. Guilliman would look at the numbers, and then look at the larger strategic picture and tell him what needed to shift and why. Then Hollis would run the numbers again. It saved lives all the same. The core change Guilliman introduced to the Navy was what he called reaction corridors. These were pre-planned fallback routes running between key star systems, seeded with hidden supply caches and emergency relay beacons at regular intervals. They were designed for one purpose. When a colony fell, and colonies would still fall, he made no promises otherwise, the surviving ships and people would not scatter randomly into space. They would have a route. They would have a destination. They would have food, fuel, and a signal that said someone knew they were coming. It was a simple idea. The fact that it had not existed before said a great deal about how the UNSC had been running its war. He also created a new intelligence unit, separate from standard naval intelligence and reporting directly to him. He staffed it with a mix of ODSTs who had survived close engagements with the Covenant, analysts who were good at reading patterns. He put Claire Dunning in charge of the research division, She accepted the role without ceremony and got to work the same afternoon. The unit's primary task was not weapon analysis. There were already people doing weapon analysis. This unit was tasked with studying Covenant theology. Several senior officers thought this was strange. Guilliman explained it once and did not explain it again. The Covenant fought because they believed they were doing the will of their gods. Every decision they made, which planets to target, in what order, with what level of force, was shaped by that belief. Understanding why they chose their targets required understanding what their religious doctrine said about humanity. Ignoring that dimension of the enemy was like fighting a man without ever trying to understand what made him angry. You could beat him, eventually perhaps, but you would take far more hits than necessary. He had spent 10,000 years fighting enemies who used faith as a weapon. He knew this territory well. Month by month, the changes took hold. Not smoothly. Nothing that large ever changes smoothly. There were officers who resisted. There were commanders who submitted formal complaints through Cole about overreach and disruption. There was a logistics colonel who told Hollis loudly, in a corridor outside a planning room, that they were reinventing the wheel to please an alien. Guilliman heard about that. He did not punish the colonel. He sent the man a written summary of the specific supply failure that had cost a frigate crew their lives 3 months earlier, traced directly back to the exact part of the system the colonel was defending. He did not add any commentary. He just sent the data. The colonel submitted no further complaints. Slowly, like a machine that had been running wrong for a long time, and was being carefully adjusted back into alignment, the UNSC began to function differently. Decisions moved faster. Ships knew where they were going and why. When colonies were attacked, the evacuation framework meant that survivors had somewhere to run to. The reaction corridors began to fill with quiet, steady traffic. Ships resupplying, wounded being evacuated, reinforcements moving to the right places instead of wherever the last desperate signal had come from. Recruitment numbers went up. Morale, which had been a flat line for months, began, very slowly, to rise. 3 colony governors who had begun, privately, to think about what a negotiated settlement with the Covenant might look like, quietly stopped thinking about it. Guilliman's projections showed a war that was still hard, still long, still full of pain, but also a war with a direction. That was something they had not had before. A direction, a plan. The difference between a path and a cliff edge. Nobody called it a miracle. Guilliman would not have stood for that word. He called it preparation, and he said it with the flat certainty of a man who had been preparing humanity's survival since before most of them were born. He did not celebrate any of it. He barely slept. He moved from problem to problem, like a man who knew exactly how many problems were still waiting, and how much time there was to deal with them. There was never quite enough time. There never was. But for the first time since the war began, there was a plan.